Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Luke Johnson from Noetic, the Humanities Teaching app, and today we're doing a very special interview with the author of this here book, Inscrutable Malice, Theodicy, Eschatology, and the Biblical Sources of Moby Dick. Everybody knows Dr. Jonathan Cook. He's done many seminars for us so far on Pierre, Moby Dick, Billy Budd, House of Seven Gables, and The Confidence Man. How many? Am I leaving anything out?
Israel Potter.
Israel Potter? Yeah, that's right. I might, if I can get his permission, I might start recording this Melville poem. Was it Clarel?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Hopefully, I can entice you to take up a study of that. But because I'd really like to make an audiobook on it. But today we're going to talk about your physical book, Inscrutable Malice. And I have to say, and I've told Dr. Cook this off camera and via my Facebook page and stuff like that. This is one of the most well-researched books I've read in a great while. It's a beautiful secondary source for anyone who's trying to make it through Melville's Moby Dick. And it will illumine so many correlations with the Bible. And the prose is brilliant and the research is incredibly deep. So I think we should get into the discussion of your text. And I guess to begin, what gave you the idea to write this book?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks so much for doing this. So this book emerged out of my a bigger project actually that I was working on apocalyptic influences on American literature and Melville in particular. And I was going to do chapters on major American Renaissance writers, including Melville, and originally I was going to have a chapter on Moby Dick, and it would pretty much cover the apocalyptic and the Job kind of theodicy aspects to the book. And when I was working on this chapter, I realized that this was a much bigger topic than just a chapter. Originally my interest in Melville and apocalyptic ideology came from a book that I wrote on the Confidence Man, which was my doctoral dissertation at Columbia, and that was published in 1996. So, that book left me fascinated by apocalyptic influences on American culture in the 19th century on major writers like Melville and Hawthorne and Poe, and so I started working on this larger study, and then took time off to develop this one chapter into another book, and this pretty much started at the beginning of this 2000s, and continued up until the publication 2012. So I was going to the library a lot, just sort of letting this whole project evolve and really teaching myself about the sort of New Testament and Old Testament scholarship, trying to get a feel for particularly for the Old Testament, the influence of myth and comparative religion, for which there's been a lot of work done in the last few decades. I mean, not many literary scholars are aware of this, but there's a whole sort of revolution going on in biblical studies, which is utterly fascinating if you take an interest in it, particularly if you're a literary scholar and you want to make some connections between religion and literature. You really have to know what's going on in this field, because it doesn't stand still. There's always new developments, and a lot of the interpretations that you get from traditional literary scholarship are very much a part of biblical scholarship these days. They've really absorbed some of the same ideas and philosophies. So that's kind of how and when I wrote it.
I'd have to say, it's interesting as someone who's done a lot of biblical research like you lately. I mean, it does offer a bit of a Rosetta Stone for decoding a lot of our literature and philosophy.
Yeah.
It's really... So there's definite value in it. And I think you were mentioning earlier how you began writing this book in the early 2000s, and something I was saying to you just just moments ago was, I was, as someone who's just written his first book, and finished up my doctoral dissertation, I can appreciate how much research and how much time it took to do this. And I think I'm just kind of curious, and I think the audience would like to know a little bit more about the backstory, about how long it took you to write it, what your process was, where you wrote it. I mean, just kind of pull back the curtains a little bit.
Yeah, well, we both live in Northern Virginia, and I came here in the late 90s and sort of was in Washington, D.C. for a couple of years, and then came out here in 2001. So I benefited from some of the scholarly libraries in the area, like Georgetown, Library of Congress, George Mason, American University, and pretty much relied on Georgetown to get books. I had a membership in the library, so I could use it whenever I wanted. Occasionally going to the Library of Congress, but so much, as is true today, so much is more and more is getting put online. So you really have just this amazing amount of resources available, and for me it was just keeping track of everything. I mean, in a way, I didn't have that big of a challenge because my book is a close reading of Moby Dick, so I didn't have to deal with several authors and lots of different things to say about these different books. I mean, I'm dealing with one book and just doing a very close reading of the whole structure, and so I would pretty much, I knew sort of my structure would divide up into different parts of the novel and what the best approach would be after I wrote a general introduction. So I could sort of work on several chapters at a time because I kind of knew what each chapter was trying to say about that particular part of the book. You start these things because you're curious, because you enjoy making discoveries, and you want to teach yourself about the subject. Of course, in the back of your mind, these days, for anyone, I think, in academia, particularly for someone like me, is, how am I ever going to get something like this published? I mean, first of all, publishers don't really like that much literary criticism. It doesn't sell very well. And they don't like literary criticism that's very long. They like nice short books of 150 pages. Mine is 300 pages or so. And the question is, how are you going to find a publisher? Because I'm not following in any particular academic groove. I'm not dropping buzzwords and invoking some of the latest literary theories. I'm pretty much just striking out on my own. And particularly for me, when the economy crashed in 2008, I said to myself, well, there goes my book. How am I ever going to get published if we're going to face a new depression when publishers are all going to go bankrupt and no one is going to have any money, and the last thing they want to do is read literary criticism. So I got very depressed for a while, and then after a couple of years, when the economy made a bit of a comeback, I realized, well, I can't afford to have done all this work and just let this project sit on a shelf. So then I kind of got galvanized into action and sent letters out to publishers, and as is usually the case, you send out 25 letters or 30, 40 letters, and one or two people take a little nibble. And fortunately I had one press that had done a few Melville books, Northern Illinois University Press, and they expressed some interest, and I found a sympathetic editor, and so I was lucky, but I had, every step of the way there are hurdles, because even when you have an editor interested, you can have readers, and I had one reader who thought my book was brilliant, and then another reader who thought that it should be half its length, and didn't like this and that. So the question is, what do you do, when you face a situation like that, and how strong a stand will you take to defend your own work, as opposed to taking out big chunks of things that you are convinced are very important. So luckily, the publisher went with the opinion of the positive reader and ignored the other reader pretty much. And so I squeaked by. So it's amazing how sort of perilous the road to getting something out to the public is, even for something as relatively small as a book of literary criticism. I mean,
well, this is how all great stuff goes, right? it's
an obstacle course.
It's people who are
yeah.
Right. Like, you have to be put through this Rube Goldberg machine, right? And there's sort of this chance happening. And luckily for us, the positive commentator opinion won the day, because this is so detail rich, and you're not going to do. Yeah. If you read this book, you're not just going to learn about Moby Dick. You're going to be learning about the Bible. You're going to be learning about Paradise Lost. You're going to be learning about the relationship that Melville had with Hawthorne. I mean, on and on and on, about other religions. Like you mentioned earlier, the comparative religions. So I'm glad you didn't leave out any of those details, and I think that's one of the real strengths of the book, and that's going to be something I was going to ask you is what, I've sort of expressed my opinion about what's so great about the book, but what do you think, in your own estimation, the book accomplishes that no other book has done?
Well, the book it really gives a very comprehensive overview of the theological and moral and philosophical underpinnings of this book, which is what Melville intended it to be understood as, a philosophical, theological drama that was intended to have sort of Shakespearean and Miltonic and Homeric resonances. He was going for the gold in terms of, comparisons with the great writers of the West. And that really, it began with the Bible, because the Bible was the foundation for American culture, for Western culture, and he was using it as a template for his storytelling, which a lot of writers do, especially people like Shakespeare and Milton. There are many books on Shakespeare and the Bible, Milton and the Bible, because those were the texts that they grew up on, and they sort of provided a moral foundation for their understanding of the world. And for Melville, this was the world that he was writing in and against. He's writing in 1850, 1851. The country was pretty much in the midst of a prolonged religious revival called the Second Great Awakening. And Protestantism was the moral law of the land. There were more and more Catholics coming in as immigrants, but they were, creating a lot of stress on the political system. They were immigrants going to cities in New York and Philadelphia, and there was a lot of pushback against them. In fact, there was a whole political party in the 1850s called the Know-Nothings, who were created to fight against the immigrants coming in. So America as a Protestant nation was very much the reality when Melville was writing, and he grew up going to church every Sunday, sometimes twice on Sunday, when he was living up in Albany with his near his Dutch Reform family of his mother. And so when that happens, and when you go to schools and you're learning in elementary school about Christian antiquities. You're learning some Latin, maybe some Greek if you're planning to go to college, but you're mainly, the purpose of college at that point still was pretty much to train for the ministry. That, of course, changed later on, but the foundation of colleges in the U.S. was pretty much designed to create a place for the clergy to study. This was the world that Melville lived in. This was the world that he was writing about in Moby Dick and writing against, creating a drama that was challenging some of the basic dogmas of the Judeo-Christian heritage, like the goodness of God, the idea that the creation is good, based on the first chapter of Genesis. My book is pretty much a reminder that this is the book that Melville was writing. It's not the book that contemporary academic critics see when they impose some of their own favorite, ideologies on the book. It's pretty much how it was created, and for me, it's really kind of trying to take the patina of age off of this beautiful painting. I think of it as sort of removing the grime from the Sistine ceiling or something like that. It's taking this aging effect off and looking at the vibrancy of the colors that you see underneath. 'Cause it really is a vibrant book. I mean, very so much alive with the intellectual and dramatic action from the narrator Ishmael. I also wanted to make readers aware that they really need to read the whole book. I mean, so many people pick up Moby Dick, and they get to the whaling chapters, right?
Right.
And they suddenly realize that they're going to have to sort of wade through a whole bunch of information about whaling before they're going to get back to the dramatic action of the book. So,
that was one of the great words that I learned from your book was the study of whales. I believe it's called cetology.
Cetology,
is that right?
Yeah. Cetus is the Latin word for whale. Yeah. So another thing is I show that the study of the whale is integral to this vision that Melville has about the cosmos and the creation. Sort of whales are sort of these archetypal creatures who are, first of all, Moby Dick is a whale, so you have to know something about the whales to understand this character of the novel. But in keeping with the book as a compilation of all kinds of genres, I mean, part of this book is really an amazing study of natural history of the time, inserted into the novel as a sort of manifestation of the idea that this is a sort of encyclopedic index to the creation, to the world, just like the Bible tries to be a whole history of the world from the creation to the apocalypse, right? Moby Dick is trying to be a whole survey of the cosmos from beginning to end, from humans and natural creatures included. Again, the whale is incorporated into the biblical vision because whales form a part of the Bible as sort of sea monsters, as sea creatures, as sort of archetypal, what I call chaos monsters.
Because you have all the episodes of Leviathan and Jonah and the whale, right?
And the Psalms as well, and the prophets. The creation myth from the ancient world, from Mesopotamia, is that a hero fights a monster and creates civilization, and in many cases the monster is a sea monster, and that sea monster is correlated with the whale as the main, the largest sea creature in the world. So Melville was really, drawing parallels between the modern whale, the demonized whale of Ahab, which is Moby Dick, and then the whale as industrial product for Ishmael, he's tying in these creatures to the biblical vision of the monster. That, you know, sometimes the whale in, say, the Psalms, in Psalm 104, is a creature who's within the creation, right? He's playing around in the ocean just like any other sea creature. And then in other areas, the whale is the archetypal enemy, the sea monster who has to be overcome for there to be creation of the cosmos, right? So he's the chaos who has to be eliminated to create cosmos, which means order, of course, in Greek. And then there's always the threat that, you know, the chaotic creature has not been totally disabled. He's going to come back. You know, he's on the fringes of your community. He's going to erupt into it, which is kind of what happens in Moby Dick. This chaos monster appears, and Ishmael and Ahab are confronted with it, and Ahab, you know, envisions it as an example of what was the biblical monster that he has to kill to eliminate evil, right? Because he allegorizes the whale into sort of the embodiment of evil because it's hurt him personally.
Right.
But then again,
and I think that was another one of the great virtues of your book, is really drawing out the condition of Ahab. I think, you know, I mean, you really dwell on his physical torment and how he projects that onto to Moby Dick. And I'm not sure it was as obvious to me, just because other parts of the novel caught my attention. But I think that's one of the great things that you did in this book, was really to get inside the mind of Ahab.
Yeah. Well, he's sort of a messianic figure because he thinks that he is there to conquer evil, but he has been so obsessed with this idea that he himself has become tainted and becomes an evil agent in his own right by assuming this unauthorized power over his men, causing their death, and making a pact with Fedallah, you know, who's kind of the Mephistopheles character in this Faustian drama, to you know, kill the white whale. So, and the other thing about Ahab is that you know, he's just like Ishmael, but probably more so. He's a composite creation, you know, of the figure of Job and Milton's Satan and Prometheus and a bunch of other people. But he, one of the interesting things for me was realizing that his wound, you know, this torturing pain that he has from his leg, his lost leg rather, corresponds to what today is called phantom limb syndrome, you know, which is only really discovered in the later 19th century by a guy named Weir Mitchell, you know, this neurologist from Philadelphia, who was actually a novelist as well. You know, was a friend of you know, William James and some of the other people in the later 19th century. But this phantom limb syndrome, I mean, Melville really nailed it. He explains exactly this bizarre sensation of having pain where the missing limb is. And for Ahab, he extrapolates the idea that this is a sadistic creator who did this, you know, that shows that pain can exist without a physical body, which to him proves that there has to be a hell, because that's how, you know, you can be tortured with your soul in hell when you don't have a body. It's on the analogy of this phantom limb idea. So it's something that researchers today are just really getting to know how, you know, the actual neurological basis for this idea. But for Melville, of course, it was the mystery of how you can have pain when you have a missing limb. So, you know, it was all kinds of things like that fascinated me as part of the characterization of Ahab. Because, you know, when you read the book, I think when I read it in high school, Ahab is this operatic figure, and it all seems so unreal, you know. How could anyone be talking to the lightning in the midst of a storm and saying all kinds of crazy things about God and the Father and whatnot. So you have to sort of step back and realize that, Melville was not writing a totally realistic novel. It's symbolic realism. So every once in a while, the symbolism pushes ahead of the realism, and you have to sort of be ready for that and understand why he was doing that. And it pretty much ties in with the Job idea that this is a character who was complaining about divine injustice very vocally, just like Job did over and over in his speeches to those three comforters. So
some friends,
yeah.
Right? Well, something I was curious about when I was doing my dissertation on Kierkegaard. I know it's a little it's kind of a curveball here, but when I was doing my dissertation, I started to feel like I was doing some sort of mind or identity meld with Kierkegaard. Did you ever find yourself questioning where the boundaries between yourself and Melville were?
Yeah, that's interesting because I think when you really closely identify with an author like that, it's bound to happen. Yeah, I think about my own life because I grew up in the Melville was born in New York City, grew up in New York and then Albany, so pretty much in the Hudson Valley. He visited Boston to see his grandfather and to see some of his in-laws. Well, I was born in Washington, D.C., but grew up in the Hudson Valley just north of New York. And, I have family up the river near Albany, and I spent a lot of time around Pittsfield, where he lived from 1850 to 1863. So I know where he lived, and I visited his houses. I know his milieu, and I too spent time on ships when I was younger. In college, I spent 2 summers working as a deckhand on the Mississippi River.
Really?
Yeah, to make some money, so yeah, there are certain similarities of background, but in terms of basic temperament, yes, I really relate to Melville's style of writing. To me, he has a beautiful style. He's a real wordsmith, but he's also incredibly voracious in terms of incorporating other writers and traditions, right? Intellectually voracious individual. So you have to sort of identify with that. And I do, because it just teaches you so much about the world or the world of that writer, to read everything that they wrote and what influenced them as well. So yeah, strong identification. I'm trying to think if I had any dreams that sort of led me to some of my insights. But
I'm kind of curious. Did you find him, or did he find you as a kindred spirit? Was this someone imposed upon you? Or?
No, I found him because it's very odd, because I have to say, Moby Dick, I read him in high school, I read him in college, and I thought, well, this is interesting. But then again, as I said, it just seemed too operatic to me. And I hadn't read any of his other work, or I guess I'd read Billy Budd too in college. But it was really after college when I started reading him in the early 80s, when all of his complete works started coming out in those beautiful Library of America editions. And I read through a lot of his early fiction. I said, oh my God, this guy is amazing. I mean, he's not at all like what I thought he was originally. So, when I went to graduate school, I naturally gravitated towards him and chose The Confidence Man for a dissertation topic, and so spent a lot of time tracking a lot of things about that book and how it synthesizes a whole different vision of America in the 1850s. The world of a riverboat, not a ship in the ocean. So you really need a lifetime to really interact with an author, because you never know what you're going to discover at one point. You just have to keep investigating, right? So, I personally, I don't think any high school student should read Moby Dick, because they're just not going to get that much out of it. But I think it's a book that you can read in college, and then it becomes more resonant maybe in your mid-20s or later 20s. And then you have to read it a couple of times, and then maybe have to listen to it at least once. With this guy who did a recorded books version, William Hootens, does a really good version of it. So it's really something that you have to grow up with, not when you're young, but when you're mature enough to really understand some of the philosophical issues that Melville was dealing with. Or you have to have a better teacher to introduce these things, because I don't remember any getting a real clue to what to look for. I mean, when I was in college, one of the big influences was this political influence. Alan Himert at Harvard, who wrote a famous article about Moby Dick and the American political tradition, right? Saying that Melville was caught up in the debates of 1850, 1851 over, the compromise of 1850. That he was sort of, some of the language of the time made its way into the book from the political realm, and that has led to a whole school of criticism saying the book shows Melville engaged with the whole debate over manifest destiny and westward expansion or whatever. Well, he was to a certain extent, but I think that happened later on, by the mid-1850s, not in 1850, 1851, because at that point, all he wanted to do was to, write a book to rival Shakespeare and to rival Milton or to rival Hawthorne, whom he had just met, right? He was much more engaged in sort of literary, philosophical ideas than any kind of reaction to the political situation of the country at the time.
There's so many things I want to ask, but I think what I should delve into now is this the issue of why Protestant Christianity was such a subject for Melville. And if you could, where Melville actually ended up in his religious ideology, or where do you think he was? Because, there's a lot of different viewpoints in Moby Dick. I've heard a lot of people talk about him as being a pantheist or a polytheist. Where do you think that Melville actually ended up?
Okay, so, he's born in 1819. He was living in New York City with his parents. His father was a Unitarian. So, he was getting a religious education in church and at home, but it really didn't become that important to him until his father died in 1832, when he was 12, and that happened when they had moved to Albany in 1830, and he was surrounded by the world of the Dutch Reformed Church, which was very strongly Calvinist, right? Unitarians, of course, like his father, were not at all, Calvinist. They were moving beyond that. So religion became more important for Melville, and so he really, he went to church probably twice a day for a while in the 1830s, and heard a lot about God and predestination and punitive condemnation of sinners, and the idea of predestination sort of got him thinking, and I think there was sort of a natural revolt for him, because I think he saw his family facing disasters like the death of the father, and who was, a very gentle, benevolent man, although he messed up his business career terribly. So Melville saw his father's death and his father's bankruptcy, and then, of course, his brother went bankrupt running the family fur business in 1837, right? He tried to make a comeback by continuing what the father was doing, which was dealing with furs, because living in Albany, you had access to a lot of beaver pelts and things like that from up north. And so Melville saw the struggles of his family, and they said, do we really deserve that from a just and benevolent deity? And then, of course, he struggled to find a career for a few years. He tried school teaching. He didn't make any money out of that. This was the country was in a depression at this point in the late 1830s. And then finally he went to sea at the end of 1840, right, early 1841, went to the Pacific and saw Christian missionaries forcing religion on these fairly contented Polynesian peoples, and bringing, being the sort of at the forefront of diseases that these people were not immune to, and coming along with the exploitation of native peoples and their wealth and their women. And so he saw the downside of Christianity in its missionary incarnation. And so this seed of revolt was, gradually nurtured in him in the 1840s. Although the part of him was very devout and admired the example of Christ, and thought the New Testament was a miracle of moral clarity. But then he saw what was happening in the world, and he saw what happened in his own life, and he became a rebel by the time he wrote Moby Dick. And he'd also read people like Pierre Bayle and Montaigne, and so he had been sort of inculcated with this idea of religious skepticism. It shows up in Moby Dick, it shows up in Pierre, and I think throughout the 1850s he's writing literary works which are profoundly questioning different aspects of Christianity, one thing or another. Moby Dick is pretty much focused on the Old Testament, Pierre is pretty much focused on the New Testament, but a lot of his short fiction has more of a sort of New Testament focus. And so you really have to, call him a skeptic in the 1850s. And then by the 1860s and 70s, he's kind of inching back to a sort of a more neutral position. He never became a devout believer, but for instance, he started, when he moved back to New York in 1863, he eventually joined the church of his wife, the Unitarian church there. So he went to church, and I think he pretty much embraced the moral vision of Christianity, but he'd given up anything to do with the metaphysical, aspects like the resurrection and miracles and things like that. But he strongly endorsed the moral vision of Christ as well. But of course, he compared that to what he saw in the U.S. and we saw in the world, and that's the source of a lot of his anguish and the source of a lot of his fiction as well. Because, people who read Moby Dick, mostly if they're the general public, they don't realize that he wrote a huge novel in verse, Cleral, in 1876, about a bunch of pilgrims going around the Holy Land. Well, pilgrims, in quotation marks, a bunch of Americans and other nationalities visiting the Holy Land in a 4-day circuit and talking about religion in the modern world. And this is really the consummation of his religious vision, because it shows him as an anguished, individual who, who would like to believe, but he can't believe. On the other hand, he admires a lot of things about Christianity, and he criticizes a lot of things, and he just doesn't know what you can replace it with. He has this kind of sense that this is the last religion we'll ever have, and it's either this or nothing, and if there's nothing, then we're losing a lot. He can't make the step out of the world that he grew up in.
You know whose it sounds a little bit like the perspective of have you ever watched? I'm sure you have, but do you ever watch like Bergman films, like The Seventh Seal or whatever? Yeah. I'm thinking specifically of like the knight in The Seventh Seal, who's like, why can't I tear this idea of God from my mind?
Yeah.
So he wants to be done with religion, but can't be done. Has anyone ever tried to do sort of a parallel analysis of Bergman and Melville?
No,
are they kindred spirits?
I don't know much about Bergman's life personally, but yeah, that's a good idea. I think, there's a lot of interesting people in this tradition. From what my opinion, or what I've read, is that it's kind of like this idea of psychological imprinting. Once this is imprinted on you, if you have little ducks, and you take away their mother and you give this sort of weird shaped creature to them, they'll learn that that's what the mother looks like, and even though it's not a real one, so it's imprinted in their brains, and religion is kind of like that. If you grow up with this sense that this is the way the world should be, and this is who God is, and you have a whole Bible to explain the world to you, you really can't ever give it up, even if you don't really believe in it anymore. So what you feel is regret for the loss of this system of meaning, right? On the other hand, you have people who feel relief in giving it up because they don't feel imprisoned by these narrow ideologies anymore, people who've sort of thrown aside their fundamentalism. So it's sort of a weird dichotomy of regret and relief, and you never know which side of the coin someone is going to fall on. But Melville was definitely one of the people who felt the regret and never quite thought his way out of the Christian paradigm, But there's some other interesting work though on this, because this was the same problem in Europe. A lot of people were facing the same issues. There's some interesting literature on this. Arthur Koestler, wrote about this in some of his fiction as well. So there's a sort of minority tradition of people who are in the same boat about feeling that they can't let go of religion, but they have to find some kind of substitute for it that's never going to work as well, but they can't do anything else.
Yeah. I think an interesting foil to Melville would be Nietzsche.
Yeah.
As being this individual that falls down more on the liberation side, which I use in air quotes because. It's not like Nietzsche was an uncomplicated character. He was a pretty tortured dude. Yeah, definitely
a lot of interesting comparisons with Nietzsche there, especially when you think about Pierre, because there's a chapter in Pierre that sounds exactly like, Nietzsche's Antichrist, talking about the physically destructive effects of Christianity on the body. This asceticism that is so evident in from the tradition of St. Paul. And there's a chapter in Pierre where the narrator talks about Pierre at his writing desk, freezing in the middle of winter and without any adequate clothing, and writing a book and his ink freezing in his inkwell. And he says there, I forget who he's addressing, but see your victim here, austerity or whatever. So definitely a lot of comparative work that could be done with Nietzsche and Melville. I hadn't thought about the Christian effects on the body in a while. What's interesting is I found out last night that Hugh Jackman is playing St. Paul in a movie. So Wolverine is going to be playing Paul. So at least I'll have a pretty jacked St. Paul. Yeah. Oh, wow. wonder what that is going to be part of.
It probably won't be that biblically reliable, but I think it's funny. I mean, one of the questions is like, why hasn't more biblical sort of criticism or exploration of these Protestant topics in Melville occurred? Is it just because academics are so secular that they become like religiously illiterate? I mean, they don't even know?
That's part of it, yes, definitely. They never really had it around them growing up, and they don't know it, and they just are sort of oblivious of it, which is too bad, and it's also doesn't do justice to the writers for whom religion is important. So if you want to know something about the writer, you got to study their milieu, and that's certainly true for mid-19th century American writers. And it's also kind of disturbing because there have been some really great people who worked in this genre. I'm thinking of Northrop Frye and Robert Alter, who's done these wonderful translations of the Bible, also has done collections of essays about the Bible and religion. So Robert Alter is one of the writers I really, he's a hero for me in terms of the work he has done in this field. And Harold Bloom has some provocative stuff, but I mean he's all over the map. But he definitely thinks this is a vital part of Western tradition, and you need to know it, right? So, some of his work I think is off the deep end, but a lot of his work is very stimulating and massively informed with his knowledge.
I can't believe we've never talked about Harold Bloom before. I mean, but that's a topic for another day. But I'd love to get your.
Well, he sees the Bible, the influence of the Bible. Unfortunately, his sort of approach to literature is deliberately sort of amoral. So he doesn't, some of his conclusions are strange and sort of peculiar, but he's always provocative, and he also knows so much that he's always able to sort of bring things in to sort of rev up the debate, because his comprehension includes so many different writers, and he knows the importance of tradition and influence on writers. So yeah, I mean, I'm hoping to spark some kind of mini revival of this subject. I mean, as I mentioned, I published a book with another guy, Brian Yothers, a collection of essays on Melville and religion, just this past year, and we'll see how much attention that gets. But it's meant to, show that this field is not nearly as active as it really should be. But on the other hand,
hopefully we can turn on a lot of people to this stuff. You've definitely got me all exercised about it. I mean,
well, on the other hand, I went to the Melville conference in London back in June. The 11th International Melville Conference. Here's the program, and I gave a paper on Israel Potter and the book of Ecclesiastes, and I was probably one of about half a dozen people who were talking about Melville and religion, but everyone else was on to other topics like post-colonialism and queer theory and race theory. So we're not really creating that much of a critical mass yet in the Melville Society. Of course, I don't know what that indicates, but that's sort of the professional organization for Melville scholars. So just like most academia today, there's a lot of different approaches, but they tend to be sort of politicized, ideological, theoretical, rather than dealing with historical or archival or biographical criticism that I embrace more and the traditional scholars work in.
That's yeah, I think it's one of the strong virtues of the book. That's why I appreciate your writing so much. So, we've talked about this a little throughout our entire conversation, but, what would you say about what Melville teaches about us today in America in 2017? I mean, it's a very unusual time in America right now, right?
Yeah.
So, and I'm sure you're doing a lot of in-process thinking as you track current events and geopolitical events and everything else. I mean, where do you see the points of intersection between what's going on here in our culture and what Melville's doing?
Well, I think you sort of have to be careful not to overgeneralize, but it's always worth discussing it periodically, what the impact is. So, I mean, for a lot of the beginnings of the War on Terror, the idea was that Ahab is the U.S. going against Bin Laden, say. The idea of rooting out evil in the world has been a big American preoccupation. And sometimes we've been good at it, and sometimes we've been pretty bad at it. So, I mean, that's one of my points in the book, is that Ahab really, he grows out of the culture of the 1840s and 50s because it was an era of moral reform, and all these organizations were started to, eliminate drinking and to eliminate slavery and to remediate poverty and illiteracy. All the sort of social ills of the time were thought to be remediable by organizing and publishing and doing things, being sort of activist in a very strongly sort of evangelical Protestant manner. So the idea of eliminating evil in the world was very much in the air at this time, and someone like Ahab sort of is the ultimate embodiment of that. Of course, he himself is a embodiment of evil in his obsession with evil as a personal affront to himself, So I think Melville is showing that, you have an obsession with evil, but then that evil can be manifested within you yourself when you demonize people or things that don't deserve it. I mean, I only have to think of our president today, who is obsessed with the evil of the Islamic terror, right? But then he himself is so obviously, has all of these fascistic evil tendencies to repress any kind of free speech and equality of races and things like that. So the obsession with evils can sometimes go within an evil personality. On the other hand, we all have to recognize evil in the world like Ishmael does, right? He recognizes it, but then he sees it as a relative phenomena that we have to accept because it makes us a more mature individual, and we have to resist it, but we're never going to eliminate it, right? It just is going to pop up all over the world. But that doesn't mean that we should be corrupted by it. So we have to defend those liberal values that Ishmael believes in, which is pretty much skepticism towards any kind of absolutist vision of the world, which is what Ahab imposes on his on the Pequod.
It reminds me of that Nietzsche quote, something to the effect of, "When you stare into the abyss, you've got to be careful that it doesn't stare back at you."
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, the other important aspect of Melville's work today, of course, is the respect for the environment. There's so much sort of messaging you can get from Moby Dick about, respecting the whale as this miracle of creation and the oceans as this realm of infinite wonder, and the fact that the ocean is also a very capricious element. You know, it can be beautiful one day and turn into a deadly storm the next day, right? So we have to have respect and also wonder over the world that we live in. And you know, we're not doing a very good job of either of those things right now. So you know, so the moral.
So there's a great critique about the fanatical piety of slaying foreign dragons, right? And then there's this ecological message as well. Yeah, which I think is absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, well, you know, whaling was a very, you know, it was like the oil business today. I mean, it was the leading business for fuel of the mid-19th century, right? All the lamps in America were or most of them were, it was the high-grade oil, you know, whale oil, and you know, you could burn tallow, animal fat, but it didn't give nearly as good a flame. So this was an industry that, you know, Melville worked in, and he accepted that fact. On the other hand, if you read Moby Dick, you see him as noticing the incredible brutality and cruelty of killing these whales, and, you know, showing yourself the master of creation. So there's a sort of dual consciousness going on there, in his understanding that this is the way the industry works, but then again, it's a horrible industry. He could not really envisage an economy based on petroleum because it didn't exist at the time. You know, it was only discovered in the U.S. in the late 1850s. So that was the way the world worked when he was a whaler himself and writing about it.
Did Melville know about dinosaurs?
Yeah, that's an interesting
that
point.
Would have been
Yes, the first creatures identified as dinosaurs were being discussed, you know, in the 1830s and 40s.
Right.
There is, you know, a footnote about this dinosaur that has been dug up in Alabama, and they, you know, they were really kind of mystified about what these creatures were. They thought they were maybe before the flood. They were antediluvian creatures. So there wasn't a firm sense of how old they were. Of course, they couldn't date them. But they were beginning to accept the fact that, you know, the idea of extinct animals went against the whole Christian natural theology of the time, which says that, you know, creatures shouldn't go extinct. There was a creation and everything was there, and, you know, it's there permanently because God made it, right? So only with the Origin of Species in 1859 did people start to realize that, you know, species have a reason to go extinct, and there's a reason for them to evolve into new species, right? Because there was a resistance to accepting the idea of extinction unless you put these creatures, say, before the flood somehow.
I don't know. I would push back on that a little bit. I wouldn't say that extinction challenges God's plan, but
well, that's what they believed. I mean, that was the. I'm not saying.
Oh, that may have been. Yeah. That may have been what they believed, but I'm just like, if God wanted an animal to go extinct, He could make it go extinct.
Yeah, right.
You know, but if that's what they believed,
that's the
real issue.
Yeah. Well, you know, there were controversies at the time. I mean, Richard Owen was at the British Museum, who was the great expert on dinosaurs, but also a very religious man. It was really after the Civil War that the science of, you know, dinosaurs really evolved in the U.S. especially.
I feel like Melville would have been totally fascinated with dinosaurs.
Yeah.
if he knew more about them. I mean, I feel like an alternative history coming up here, reimagining Moby Dick with dinosaurs or something like that. Yeah. I'm sure that's a great affront to sensibilities, but well, I find it amusing.
His world, though, was still pre-Darwinian. I mean, the world he grew up with was based on the truth of the creation, creationism. And, he read science, he read Chambers' Vestiges of creation, which was the big book in 1844 about how life evolved according to its own scientific laws. But the idea was it's still a sort of Lamarckian idea in that creatures sort of will their own changes to the environment. Right. But it was a very influential book, and it shows a whole history of creation from the formation of the solar system to the evolution of life on Earth. And and Melville read that. It influenced one of his early novels called Marty. And it's really a mystery. And Melville read Darwin's Journal of Researches, his first book about his voyage of the Beagle. But we don't know exactly when he would have read Origin of Species, but it's certain that he did read it. But there's no record of him actually owning a copy or mentioning it. He mentions it in Clairol, but not very directly. I mean, he mentions Darwin at the very end.
Well, being such a learned man, I'm sure he was familiar with the idea. Yeah. I mean, even Erasmus Darwin was kicking around the idea, and I think that planted the seed for Charles. And I mean, to be honest, the idea of evolution has been around for a long time.
Yeah. Right.
I mean, you can see. I remember reading Aristotle, and Aristotle entertains it and then rejects it. So I don't where we develop a lot of our modern concepts of science. It's sort of sometimes it seems pretty arbitrary where we decide that idea came into existence. Yeah. Like for instance, the evolution of the solar system idea. I mean, you can see traces of that in Egyptian culture. I was reading the Emerald Tablets of Thoth the other night, and it's right there. Yeah. It's right there.
Yeah, but it's. The ideas have not been, formulated in modern ways to.
Right.
But yes, I agree. So the idea of evolution was in the air when Melville was a young man, and he was aware of that. But when Origin of Species came out and really changed the landscape, he'd already finished. With his career as a novelist, right? He published his last novel in 1857. Origin of Species comes out in 1859. We don't hear from Melville again until he published his collection of Civil War poetry, Battle Pieces, in 1866. And then he publishes Clairol, this long novel in verse, in 1876. And he does mention Darwin right at the end of this poem. And he has one of his characters in the poem is a guy named Margoth, who's a geologist, and he's made to look like a jerk because he has such a sort of reductionist idea about the world. He's always going around with his hammer knocking on stones and making sort of stupid remarks about how geology is going to solve all the world's problems. So he's made to look like a very limited, blinkered individual in a way that, it's kind of, if I was a scientist, I would be very bothered to read this, because it doesn't make science look very good. But it was sort of the romantic image of science, the Wordsworthian idea that, we kill to dissect, you get rid of the organic, vital principle to be able to study something scientifically.
Right. Oh man, I could go on about this stuff forever. Why do we? We're over an hour, so we should probably bring it to a close here. Yeah. But maybe you could just say something in closing about the reception that your book has received in the scholarly community, and what the future and present are for you in terms of research.
Yeah. Okay, so the book came out in 2012. I got 2 or 3 really glowing reviews, which I really was happy about. I got some nice feedback from a few individuals personally. You know, I included my email address on the back book jacket if anyone wanted to tell me their opinion. Of course, you never hear from very many people, plus libraries tend to take the jackets off of books before they catalog them. I did get not a very nice review from the Melville Society publication Leviathan, which kind of surprised me. But it was written by an older scholar who was, I think his main point was, you know, you can't say this because I didn't say it, you know, sort of. And so how come you're not giving me more attention, right? How come you're breaking out of the world, the stuff that I said, you know?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you're not making people angry, you're not doing it right?
Yeah. So that was very kind of infuriating. But otherwise, I count on, you know, just building up slowly more readers. It's just a little disheartening how little impact one particular book of literary criticism has in the overall scheme of things if you're not, you know, a big name academic. But I just, you know, things like this, what we're doing today is, I hope will be helpful to bring the book to a bigger audience. And
and we should tell people where they can get it. I mean, obviously you can get it on Amazon, and that we should talk about what's your email address again?
It is jcookinscrutable@gmail.com. So
right.
JCOK Inscrutable.
Right, and this is, like you mentioned earlier, this is from Northern Illinois Press, and you can go check that out at www.niupress.niu.edu, and I imagine they still have copies of this, so you can get it.
I should say that I did get a nice acknowledgement. In 2014, I was asked to give a keynote address at a conference on religion and literature. I went down to San Antonio, and there were about 100 people there, and I talked about Moby Dick and 21st century theodicy, a different topic, and an essay that I hope to publish in the near future. So that was nice. And as far as other work goes, I have a whole other book that I'm trying to get published now. That was the book I was originally working on when I started this project on Moby Dick. It's going to be called Harbingers of the Millennium. You know, the apocalyptic imagination in American romantic writing and antebellum culture. So it's going to be a huge survey. And I'm going to be sending out letters very soon, really, to publishers, and you know, we'll see what happens there. But I'm keeping up with a bunch of articles on all kinds of other subjects, including Melville and religion. I have, you know, something came out recently on Billy Budd in a collection. I have an essay on Melville's visit to London coming out next spring. And a book on Melville's Civil War poetry coming out at some point, I hope in the next year or two, that grew out of a conference 2013 on Melville and Whitman and the Civil War. So, you know, lots of other things in the pipeline.
It's like I said, it's an inspiration, man, to read your book and to hear about all the projects that you have going on. So I just want to thank you again for talking about all this stuff today, and thank you for teaching me and so many others about Melville and his contemporaries. And I guess we should just bring us to a close, and we'll talk for a second about what we want to do next.
Good. Okay.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Cook.
Okay. Thank you.